Before Azazel forged weapons, someone had already opened the door. History remembers metal's sound, not the whisper that justified it. We picture blades, armor, fire in men's hands. We imagine Azazel teaching destruction, but weapons don't appear in a vacuum. They require permission, intention, a fracture in the human heart. And that fracture had a name, Gadreel. His name is not spoken often. It doesn't echo like Azazel's. It is quieter, almost hidden. Ancient traditions say Gadreel deceived Eve, approaching the garden not with iron, but suggestion. If true, the first rebellion didn't begin with a sword, it began with a conversation. While Semyaza led watchers and Azazel armed corruption, Gadreel crossed the boundary between heaven and human will. He didn't descend in open defiance. He entered subtly, a presence, a voice, a distortion of trust. The garden was alignment, humanity in harmony with divine order. Opening the door wasn't breaking a lock. It introduced doubt where certainty lived. It suggested autonomy could replace obedience, knowledge replace reliance, power be seized. Once that door was opened, it never fully closed. Imagine the moment. No armies, no bloodshed. Just a question placed carefully inside the human mind. Did God really say? That question didn't teach violence directly. It did something deeper. It shifted authority inward. It made the human will the final judge. That shift is the seed of every later rebellion. Azazel would later teach men how to forge blades. But what use is a blade if the heart hasn't accepted using it? Semyaza would bind the watchers by oath. But what power does an oath have if defiance is already conceived? Gadreel's act was not loud. It was foundational. He did not teach war. He made war conceivable. By introducing the idea that boundaries could be crossed without immediate consequence, he reshaped humanity's spiritual psychology. Trust fractured, innocence thinned. The relationship between heaven and earth became tension, and tension breeds conflict. When humanity stepped beyond its original design, vulnerability entered the world. Fear followed vulnerability. Competition followed fear, and from competition, the logic of domination slowly emerged. Long before iron met flesh, the human mind had already begun calculating advantage. This is why Gadreel's role feels more dangerous than it appears. Azazel forged weapons, but Gadreel altered perception. Semyaza organized rebellion, but Gadreel normalized disobedience. The first door he opened was not made of wood or stone. It was cognitive, a threshold inside the human spirit where trust gave way to Once humanity tasted autonomy detached from divine alignment, the cascade became inevitable. The Watchers who descended later did not step into a perfectly sealed world. They entered one where the idea of crossing limits had already been modeled. Gadreel crossed first, and crossing first changes everything. Because once a boundary is crossed and judgment does not fall immediately, boldness increases. What begins as curiosity becomes experimentation. What begins as experimentation becomes culture. And what becomes culture is far harder to uproot than a single act of rebellion. If Gadreel truly deceived in the garden, then he did more than tempt. He reoriented the human relationship with authority. He made the forbidden seem negotiable. He made consequence seem distant, and that subtle distortion prepared the world for everything that followed. For the descent of the Watchers, for the oath of Semyaza, for the weapons of Azazel, for the violence that would eventually fill the earth. Before metal struck metal, the mind had already shifted. Before war was organized, the will had already separated. And what he taught humanity still hasn't disappeared. But the consequences of that first whisper were only beginning to unfold. If the first door was opened in silence, the next step was to walk through it. Some ancient traditions identify Gadreel as the one who deceived Eve in the garden. Not merely a symbolic serpent, but a watcher who approached still innocent humanity and planted something more dangerous than any weapon: conscious disobedience. The garden was not merely an idyllic setting, it was a spiritual state. Their human will was still aligned with divine will. There was no competition. There was no calculation. There was no need to dominate. Trust was natural. Obedience, spontaneous. Betraying the garden didn't mean destroying trees or breaking down walls. It meant corrupting trust. Gadreel brought no iron. He brought no armor. He taught no one how to forge blades. He brought an idea, the possibility of choosing against the Creator without fully understanding the cost, and that is the root of moral corruption. The disobedience taught by Gadreel was not impulsive, it was rationalized. He did not command rebellion, he suggested autonomy. He did not impose violence, he hinted at independence. In doing so, he shifted the center of authority from heaven to the human heart. And when authority shifts, morality becomes negotiable. The act in the garden was not merely the breaking of a rule. It was the birth of self-legit. For the first time, humankind decided that it could determine for itself what was good and what was evil, independently of what had been established. This moment is more profound than it seems, because violence doesn't begin with a coup, it begins with the justification. Before someone hurts you, they need to believe they can. Before you can dominate, you need to feel that you have the right to. Before destroying, you need to redefine what is allowed. If Gadreel was responsible for introducing this rupture, then he taught something that predates weapons. He taught the idea that divine boundaries can be questioned, and since limits can be questioned, they can be surpassed. Observe the progression. In the garden, humanity did not know fear as a dominant force. But after the rupture, shame, guilt, and self-preservation arise. And where there is self-preservation without trust, the instinct to protect oneself at any cost is born. From that point on, violence ceases to be unthinkable. It's not that Gadreel taught combat techniques at that moment. He taught the first internal rupture. The first time a human being chose to assert their own will above the established order. This psychological shift is the fertile ground where violence thrives. Because when man begins to trust more in himself than in God, every conflict turns into a power struggle. Every disagreement can escalate. Every threat can justify a reaction. Azazel would later teach them how to make weapons. But Gadreel taught something more subtle, and perhaps more devastating. Inner permission. Without this permission, technical knowledge would be useless. Without this moral rupture, iron would have no purpose. The garden was betrayed not by force, but by persuasion, and that's precisely what makes Gadreel so disturbing. He did not destroy innocence with violence. He resolved it through argumentation. By introducing disobedience as a legitimate option, he inaugurated a new logic, the logic of choice over submission. And from this logic derives every subsequent form of conflict. If the first fall was spiritual, the next ones would be physical. If the first corruption was moral, the subsequent ones would be material. If the first act of violence was against divine order, subsequent acts of violence would be between men. And this is where the suspense intensifies. Because if Gadreel was the one who betrayed the garden, then he not only participated in the story of the fall, he may have been the first to teach humanity the principle that makes all war possible, not the sword, but the decision to use it. And when that decision becomes acceptable, the world never returns to its original state. But what he did next would widen that rift in a way that few could have imagined. When we think about the origin of war, the image that comes to mind is almost always the same. Metal being forged, blades gleaming under fire. Men learned to transform stone and iron into instruments of death. This is the legacy associated with Azazel, the master craftsman. He is the instructor of weapons, the revealer of forbidden techniques. But manufacturing is not the same as origin. Before the blade existed, someone had to want to wield it. Before the armor could protect the body, something inside had decided to attack. Before Azazel, there was permission, and this permission has everything to do with Gadreel. Azazel taught them how to build. Gadreel explained why to use it. This difference completely changes the narrative. Technology does not create violence. It merely amplifies what has already been accepted internally. If Gadreel opened the door in the garden and introduced disobedience as a legitimate choice, he planted the impulse to assert will above any limit. And it is from this impulse that violence is born. The momentum is fast, it's emotional, it's instinctive. It precedes logic, planning, military strategy. The impulse says, I can. It says, I deserve it. It says, I don't need to submit. When this impulse becomes normalized, force ceases to be a last resort and becomes an available tool. Gadreel didn't need to teach combat tactics. He taught something earlier, the legitimacy of rupture. By questioning the divine limit in the garden, he showed that boundaries can be challenged, authority can be confronted, obedience is not inevitable. And when obedience ceases to be inevitable, conflict becomes possible. Imagine the post-crash scenario. Humanity now lives under fragmented consciousness. There is fear, insecurity, comparison. The perception of the other changes. The other is no longer just a companion. They can become a threat. In this new state, momentum gains ground. If someone threatens what I have, I can react. If someone challenges me for space, I can dominate. If someone resists, I can force them. It is not yet an organized war, but it is the beginning of the logic that sustains it. Azazel would arrive later, offering tools. But tools are only adopted when they meet an existing need. Gadreel taught about necessity. He legitimized the idea that force can be the solution. Previously, dependence on God was the answer to vulnerability. Then self-sufficiency becomes an alternative. And when self-sufficiency fails, strength emerges as an extension of will. This is the silent progression. First, disobedience. Then, autonomy. Next, fear. So, the impulse. Finally, strength. Realize the depth of this. If Azazel had descended into a world that was still perfectly aligned, his teachings might not have resonated. But he descended into a world already psychologically prepared to accept domination as a survival mechanism. Gadreel prepared the ground. He taught something invisible, yet essential. The inner permission to act against established limits. And when force becomes morally acceptable, even if only under specific circumstances, it begins to expand. First as a defense, then as a preventative measure, then as a control. Then, how can we be powerful? Impulse transforms into culture. This distinction between fabrication and intent is crucial. Azazel shaped the iron, Gadreel shaped the heart. And a heart inclined toward self-affirmation finds countless justifications for using what it learns to build. The violence, therefore, did not begin on the battlefield. It began in the human interior. It began when force ceased to be unthinkable and became plausible. And when something becomes plausible, it's only a matter of time before it becomes practice. But when this new logic began to spread among men, the consequences far exceeded anything the watchers themselves had imagined. Initially, violence was an impulse, an act driven by fear, an instinctive reaction to a threat, a momentary burst of strength, but something changed. When knowledge began to circulate among men, impulse ceased to be merely a reaction. It became structured. What was once an isolated act began to take shape, become a pattern, a method. This is where organized violence is born. Knowledge is powerful because it replicates itself. Once taught, it doesn't disappear. It accumulates, improves, and is transmitted. When the intention has already been legitimized, when the use of force is considered possible, knowledge becomes the inevitable next step. Azazel taught them how to forge. Gadreel taught how to desire. But when desire and technique meet, the system emerges. Violence ceases to be an isolated event. It becomes a structural issue. It's no longer just me against you. It's us against them. The human mind begins to categorize, to divide, to plan, to anticipate. Strategy emerges, and with it, collective tension. Because strategy requires organization. Men gather, they define leaders, they form alliances, they establish hierarchies. Force ceases to be merely a response and becomes a tool of control, and control requires planning. Observe how this happens. First, someone learns how to use a blade, then teach another one. Therefore, an entire group masters the technique. Next, this group realizes that it can impose its will on another group. Violence is no longer just emotional, it's calculated, it becomes preventative, it becomes expansive, it becomes politics. At this point, war ceases to be an accident and becomes a real possibility. But war is not born of iron. Iron only executes. War is born from the mind that believes domination is the solution, from the mind that sees the other as an obstacle, from the mind that calculates gains and losses in terms of power. This mindset is the real battlefield. And when this mentality spreads, the tension ceases to be individual and becomes social. Communities begin to live under the expectation of conflict. Distrust grows. Preparation becomes routine. The threat doesn't need to be real, it just needs to be possible. And collective fear is the perfect fuel for organized violence. Here is the critical point of the narrative. What began as disobedience in the garden now manifests as social structure. The inner rupture taught by Gadreel has evolved. The fabrication taught by Azazel has found purpose. And together, these elements have generated something new, the systematization of force. It's no longer about individuals making mistakes, it's about cultures shaping themselves around the idea of power. When violence becomes systemic, it gains public legitimacy. It is taught to new generations. It is celebrated as protection. It is justified as a necessity. And the more organized it becomes, the further it seems from its spiritual origins. Few remember that it all started with a question in the garden. Few realize that the root of the war lies in the decision to redefine authority. But that's precisely what makes this progression so unsettling, because systems are difficult to undo. An impulse can be contained, a person can regret it, but a social structure based on force requires something much greater to be transformed. The tension now is not just between individuals, it is between peoples. It's a matter of differing worldviews. It's a matter of ambition. Humanity is entering a new phase, no longer innocent, no longer instinctive, but strategically violent. And when violence becomes strategic, it becomes inevitable on a larger scale. But as this new order began to dominate the earth, something in the sky was already observing what was forming. That's curious. When the Watchers are mentioned, one name resonates strongly. Azazel. He is remembered as the master of weapons, the corrupter of the arts, the symbol of technological decay. His role is clear, his impact is visible, his judgment is described in detail. But Gadreel's name emerges like a shadow, brief, discreet, almost erased. And this raises a troubling question. Why doesn't someone associated with the garden's own rupture receive the same attention? The silence of the scriptures is not empty, it's tense. In some ancient texts, Gadreel appears linked to the deception in Eden. In others, he is merely mentioned among the Watchers. There are no lengthy descriptions of his punishment. There are no detailed accounts of his fall. There are no speeches attributed to him. It's as if his presence is in the subtext, and perhaps that is more disturbing than any explicit description, because what is clearly condemned can be easily identified, but what remains implicit continues to operate. Azazel represents visible corruption, weapons, adornments, instruments of war. Gadreel represents something earlier, something more subtle, interchange. Perhaps that's precisely why his name doesn't resonate with the same weight. Weapons leave marks. Intentions leave systems. Iron rusts. The mentality remains. Textual silence can be a powerful narrative strategy. It creates gaps, and gaps spark curiosity. What is not explained seems hidden. What seems hidden generates research, and the investigation generates debate. Why do the scriptures delve into the manufacture of weapons but not detail when inner permission was taught? Why is the technique openly condemned, but the intention remains diluted? Perhaps because it's easier to point at a sword than to confront an idea. Perhaps because it is more comfortable to attribute corruption to objects than to acknowledge the inner transformation that made them possible. Gadreel's name is almost fading, but his influence remains. This creates a disturbing paradox. The less that is said about him, the more profound his impact seems to be. When a figure becomes too central, it becomes a clear symbol of evil. But when a figure is peripheral, almost invisible, it becomes more difficult to define. And what is difficult to define is difficult to combat. The silence of the scriptures, in this case, functions as an echo. He doesn't explain it fully. It doesn't completely solve the problem. The narrative is not complete. He leaves space. And this space is filled by imagination, theology, reflection, and the comments of those watching. Because the question remains, if Gadreel was indeed responsible for introducing the primordial rupture, why isn't his story detailed with the same intensity? Was it forgetfulness? Was it a fragmented tradition? Or was it intentional? Perhaps the focus on Azazel is a way of externalizing guilt, of transforming the problem into something tangible. But Gadreel represents the invisible, the inner decision, the silent permission, and the invisible is more difficult to narrate. The mystery surrounding his name creates ongoing tension. It is neither fully explained nor entirely dismissed. It remains an implicit presence at the origin of organized violence. And perhaps that's the greatest irony. The angel who taught permission is hardly remembered. But permission continues to be exercised every day, and the more one tries to reduce his participation to a footnote, the more evident it becomes that something essential happened in that first moment of rupture. But when the silence of the text meets the weight of the consequences on earth, the question ceases to be historical and becomes urgent. At first he seemed isolated. A lesson here. A decision was made there. A specific conflict between two men. But violence never remains individual for very long. It spreads. What began as disobedience in the garden evolved into intention. Intention found technique. Technique found organization. And now, something even more dangerous is beginning to happen. Violence ceases to be an event and becomes culture. This is the psychological turning point. When a behavior is repeated, it loses its shock value. When it loses its shock, it loses its resistance. And when it loses its resistance, it returns to normal. War is ceasing to be an exceptional tragedy and is becoming a recurring reality. And every recurring reality shapes mindsets. Imagine generations growing up under the expectation of conflict. Children learning that strength is necessary. Young people being trained not only to work, but to fight. Battle stories being told as an honor. Combat preparation becoming part of the collective identity. What began as instruction has now become tradition. Tradition is harder to break than habit because tradition carries historical legitimacy. That's how we've always done it. This is how we survive. This is how we protect our own. Violence becomes a cultural narrative. At this point, it no longer depends on an angel teaching it. It propagates itself. Like an invisible epidemic, it passes from mind to mind, from generation to generation, without needing a new instructor. This is where the metaphor of spiritual contagion becomes powerful. An epidemic doesn't need to convince every individual from scratch. It spreads through proximity, through environment, through constant exposure. The same happens with violence when it becomes part of the collective imagination. If everyone around you believes that strength solves everything, you'll grow up believing it too. If every threat is met with aggression, aggression becomes the norm. If every victory is celebrated through domination, then domination becomes the objective. Notice the intensity of this. Organized violence not only structures armies, it structures identities. Peoples come to define themselves by their conquests. Leaders come to be valued for their ability to subdue others. Fear becomes a political tool, and when fear reigns, peace seems like weakness. This is the stage in which the contagion is complete. What began as an individual spiritual rupture now permeates entire social systems. The permission taught by Gadreel echoes in collective decisions. The fabrication taught by Azazel becomes a technical inheritance. And together, these elements create a humanity accustomed to conflict. War is no longer a surprise, she is expectation. And when something becomes an expectation, people prepare for it even before it happens. Fortifications are built, alliances are formed, distrust is cultivated, the tension becomes permanent. Imagine the sky observing this progression. What began as a conversation in the garden now manifests as battlefields. What began as doubt now echoes as war cries. And what's most unsettling, many can no longer imagine a different world. When violence becomes tradition, it justifies itself. We need to fight because we've always fought. We need to dominate because we have always been threatened. Spiritual contagion transforms memory into fuel. Every past conflict fuels the next. Every victory fuels pride. Every defeat fuels resentment. And resentment is one of the most enduring forces in human history. War ceases to be merely physical. It settles in the mind, in language, in education, in politics, in religion. It becomes an invisible structure. And when violence reaches that stage, the question is no longer whether there will be conflict, but when violence ceased to be merely tradition and began to directly challenge the limits established by heaven itself, the reaction that followed would not be silent. Up to this point, we have followed the progression of violence, from disobedience to intention, from intention to technique, from technique to system, from system to tradition. But now it is necessary to pause, because not all power is corrupt, and it is precisely here that the moral conflict becomes most profound. Strength can protect, she can defend the vulnerable. It can prevent injustices, it can contain evil. The very idea of protection presupposes some kind of power. Without strength, there is no way to resist aggression. Without the capacity to react, vulnerability becomes permanent. So the problem isn't the existence of the force. The problem is when the force changes its purpose. Domination is not protection. Domination arises when force ceases to serve and begins to control. When the objective is no longer to preserve life, but to expand power. When the other ceases to be someone to protect and becomes someone to subdue. This difference is subtle but crucial. Protection acts out of necessity. Domination is driven by ambition. Protection is limited. Domination is insatiable. Protection ceases when the threat ends. Domination creates new threats to justify its continuation. And it is at this point that Gadreel's legacy becomes most evident. By teaching inner permission to break boundaries, he opened up space for strength to be reinterpreted. The impulse that began as self-defense quickly finds justification for expansion. First, I protect myself. Then, I'll warn you. Then, I anticipate. Then, I'll take control. Then, I impose my will. The line between legitimate force and abusive domination is rarely crossed all at once. It is crossed gradually, almost imperceptibly. This is where the moral conflict arises. Because every leader, every society, every individual needs to decide, is the force I am using protecting or enslaving? Domination enslaves in two ways. She enslaves the subjugated, who then loses their freedom, and it enslaves the dominator, who then becomes dependent on control to maintain their identity. When power becomes a source of psychological security, it becomes an addiction, and addictions rarely recognize limits. Organized violence, when it arises from domination, creates structures where force is not an occasional instrument, it is a permanent foundation. The system needs enemies to sustain itself. It needs constant threats. It needs continuous tension. At this stage, force no longer protects. She demands submission. This is the most critical point in the transition because, in its purest form, strength is ability. But in its corrupted form, force is coercion. And coercion destroys that which it claims to protect. The Watcher's narrative forces us to confront this uncomfortable question. When did humanity learn to confuse power with right? Perhaps at the moment when divine authority was questioned. Perhaps it was when autonomy began to be exalted without responsibility. Perhaps when technique met ambition. The difference between force and domination lies not in the intensity of the power, but in the intention behind it. Protection preserves dignity. Domination removes it. Protection recognizes limits. Domination constantly redefines them, and when a culture begins to celebrate domination as a virtue, corruption is already well underway. What is most unsettling is that domination rarely presents itself as evil. It disguises itself as security, as order, as progress, as stability. But behind these words, there may only be the desire to control. And when control becomes a priority, freedom becomes a threat. This is the direct moral conflict that emerges from Gadreel's story. It's not just about weapons or battles. This refers to the orientation of the human heart. The force will continue to exist. The question is, in whose service? But when the line between protection and domination was definitively crossed, the response from above would not be merely silent observation. The pattern was repeating itself. First, silence. Then, the transgression. Next, the expansion. And, above all, the sky watching. Just as in the garden, when the first rupture occurred amidst the stillness, now organized violence grew under an apparent absence of immediate intervention. Peoples armed themselves. Leaders consolidated power. Traditions of war strengthened. Domination became the structure, and the sky remained silent. But divine silence never meant indifference. He carries tension. There is a type of silence that is abandonment, and there is a kind of silence that is waiting. What was forming on earth was not merely isolated conflict. It was a system sustained by corrupted intent. The inner permission taught at the beginning now echoed in collective decisions. Force had transformed into identity. Domination no longer needed justification, it was normalized, and the sky watched again. This thematic repetition is unsettling. At the dawn of human history, there was a moment when rupture occurred, and for a brief period, nothing seemed to follow in response. The consequence was not instantaneous. Judgment did not fall in the same second. This creates a dangerous illusion that there will be no response. When punishment is not immediate, audacity grows. When limits are not quickly reaffirmed, transgression multiplies. It is in this space between action and consequence that the tension intensifies. Imagine the accumulated weight of generations. Repeated conflicts, bloodshed, systematized injustices, violence not just as an act but as a culture. And yet, the sky is silent. But silence is not emptiness. It's loaded. Every human decision reverberates. Every act of domination widens the gap between original intention and present reality. The world that was born in harmony now pulsates with competition and fear. The anticipation for the trial is beginning to take shape. It is not announced with trumpets. It is not declared publicly, but it grows like a dark cloud on the horizon. Because systems based on domination inevitably reach a point of saturation. When force becomes a social foundation, injustice accumulates. When injustice accumulates, the outcry grows. And when the outcry grows, something needs to be done in response. The narrative takes on a heavy tone here. Silence ceases to be comfortable. It becomes threatening. Men may interpret the absence of intervention as approval. They may believe that the expansion of violence is inevitable and undeniable. They may assume that heaven has lost interest, but the sky watches again. An observation implies evaluation. The repetition of history suggests that there is a limit, that there is a point where collective corruption is not just human failing. It is a direct challenge to the established order. The question that lingers in the air is not whether there will be an answer. That's when climate is becoming increasingly tense. Violence is no longer the exception. It's the norm. Domination is no longer a deviation. It's political. Fear is no longer occasional. It's permanent. And when fear becomes the atmosphere, creation itself seems to struggle to breathe. The sky watched from the garden. The sky is watching now. And when the silence begins to weigh more than the noise of battles, it means that something is about to break the cycle. But when the answer finally comes, it will not merely be a correction, it will be a redefinition of boundaries that had been forgotten. The silence is finally broken. After generations of accumulating violence, after entire systems built upon domination, After the heavens have watched repeatedly, the inevitable moment arrives. Judgment, but Gadreel's trial carries a different kind of tension. Azazel, in ancient traditions, is described with clear images, chained, cast into darkness, isolated until the final day. His crime was visible. He taught how to forge weapons, revealed forbidden techniques, and spread knowledge that hastens destruction. Their punishment is concrete. Iron for iron, chain by chain. But what happens to the one who taught something invisible? If Azazel corrupted his hands, Gadreel corrupted his intentions. If Azazel armed the body, Gadreel inclined the heart. And judging the invisible requires something deeper than simply imprisoning. Gadreel's judgment symbolizes spiritual responsibility, because his transgression was not merely technical, it was structural. He not only revealed something forbidden, he altered the inner direction of humanity. He introduced the conscious possibility of breaking divine boundaries and legitimizing one's own will above the established order. This changes everything. His punishment, and the traditions that mention him, is not narrated with the same spectacle. And perhaps this is intentional, because his guilt is not associated with a specific object, but with a fundamental rupture. Gadreel symbolizes the point where choice becomes deliberate rebellion. While Azazel represents external excess, Gadreel represents internal inversion. The trial, then, is not just about punishment, it's about restoring boundaries. It is the assertion that not all autonomy is freedom, that not all force is legitimate, that not every intention can be justified in itself. At the climax of the narrative, the focus shifts from just what was taught to what was triggered. The sky doesn't only respond to the manufacture of weapons, it responds to the corruption of the essence. The idea of judgment here is not revenge, it's about restraint. Because when inner permissiveness becomes contagious, it threatens to surpass any remaining moral boundaries. If there is no intervention, the logic of domination will become definitive. Gadreel's trial symbolizes the moment when heaven reaffirms, the human mind is not the supreme authority. This is the narrative climax. The angel who taught permission is confronted by the very source of the authority he helped to challenge. The one who suggested limitless autonomy faces absolute limitation. And this carries an enormous theological and psychological weight, because Gadreel's punishment doesn't only refer to a celestial being. It talks about unseen consequences. It shows that intentions matter, which ideas have an impact. Internal ruptures generate external realities. Azazel may have been chained by the very thing he taught others to create, but Gadreel is remembered as the one whose influence demanded something even greater. The reaffirmation of divine sovereignty over human will. The trial does not erase history, but it redefines the moral compass. He declares that violence, even when organized, even when cultural, even when traditional, is not neutral before heaven. And at the moment when Gadreel is confronted, the narrative reaches its peak of tension. Human freedom continues to exist, but now under the shadow of responsibility, because the true weight of history lies not only in what was done, it lies in the fact that someone taught that it could be done. But even after the trial, the question that remains is whether humanity would learn from this intervention. The trial has begun. The security guards were confronted. Limits were reaffirmed. Corruption has reached a critical point. And so, according to ancient traditions, the earth was purified by the flood. But here arises the question that echoes after the climax. Did the flood erase Gadreel's legacy? If violence had become a system, a culture, and a tradition, could it simply disappear with the water? At first glance, the flood represents a restart, a cosmic reset, a radical cleansing. Collective corruption had reached such a deep level that the only possible response seemed to be the complete disruption of the structure that had formed. But water doesn't erase memories. It destroys physical structures. It eliminates generations. But ideas can survive. The central point here is not just who survived, but what survived. If Gadreel taught intention, if he legitimized the impulse, if he altered the way humanity understands authority and force. So the question is not just historical, it's psychological. The flood interrupted the organized violence of that ancient world, but did it eradicate the inner inclination that made it possible? After the waters recede, humanity begins again. New generation, new opportunity, new pact, but not a completely reprogrammed new heart. The biblical narrative implies that human nature remained imperfect. Violence did not disappear from later history. Conflicts resurface, disputes return, wars are repeated. This suggests something unsettling. The legacy has not been completely erased, it was transformed. Perhaps it has become less explicit, perhaps it has become more sophisticated, perhaps it has reorganized itself under new structures. But force as a solution has continued to reappear throughout human history. This maintains the narrative's retention because it creates continuity. The trial was real, the flood was devastating, but the dilemma remains. Violence does not arise solely from external circumstances. It is born from the mind. It arises from the interpretation of force. It stems from the decision to dominate or protect. If the human heart still holds the capacity to choose domination, then the echo of Gadreel still resonates, not as an active presence, but as a permanent possibility. The flood may have brought an end to an era of mass corruption, but it did not eliminate the moral conflict, and perhaps that's the most disturbing part of the story, because it means that the real battlefield was never just geographical. It has always been an interior person. Each generation inherits not only land and culture, but choices. The question returns in every era: force or domination? Protection or control? Limits or absolute autonomy? If the flood had completely erased the legacy, subsequent history would have been free of war. But it isn't, and this transforms the post-climax echo into deep reflection. Gadreel's trial scored a point. The flood marked another, but human responsibility remained. The violence has not disappeared. She evolved. It became more organized, more technological, more strategic, but its root remains the same: the way the heart interprets power. And as long as this interpretation continues to be debated within the human mind, the legacy will not be entirely extinct. The ultimate question isn't just what happened to Gadreel. This is what happens to us when faced with the same choice. Because history may have flown through the waters, but the real judgment always begins within each generation. At this point in the story, we are no longer talking about angels. We are not talking about watchers, nor about the garden, nor about celestial currents. We're talking about us. We no longer need Gadreel to legitimize the impulse. We don't need Azazel to forge weapons. We learned on our own. The question now is not historical, it's current. If we've already seen the cost of violence, lived through world wars, witnessed genocides, bombs, destruction on a global scale, why do we still choose war? The answer is uncomfortable, because war begins long before the battlefield. It begins with the narrative. It begins when we transform the other person into a permanent threat, when we simplify complex conflicts into us versus them, when we believe that losing control is worse than losing lives. It's not about angels right now. It's about fear. Fear of losing power, fear of losing identity, fear of losing security. And fear, when left untreated, seeks protection in force. We return to the same crossroads: force or domination. Humanity still chooses war because war offers something seductive: artificial clarity. She simplifies the world. Define your enemies. Organize your priorities. Create a collective purpose. In the midst of chaos, war seems to offer direction. But it's a direction built on destruction. The emotional impact here is unavoidable. We realize we are not analyzing some distant myth. We are examining a recurring human pattern. Technology has evolved. Political systems have evolved. Global communication has evolved. But the inner conflict remains surprisingly similar. We still justify aggression as prevention. We still defend domination as stability. We still confuse power with security, and perhaps the most unsettling aspect is this: often, we believe we are fighting for peace, This reveals the depth of the paradox. War is often presented as a last resort, but it repeatedly becomes a recurring recourse. Why? Because war offers quick results. Diplomacy requires patience. Dialogue requires vulnerability. Admitting mistakes requires humility, and humility is rarely celebrated in power structures. If Gadreel symbolized permission to push boundaries, and Azazel symbolized the technical ability to execute that decision, so today, responsibility can no longer be transferred. We cannot point to celestial beings. We cannot blame unseen forces. Choices are human. Governments choose, leaders choose. Societies make their choices, individuals choose. And each choice reinforces or challenges the tradition of violence. The modern connection is clear. War is not inevitable because of the past. It is possible because of the present. It continues to exist because, repeatedly, we believe that dominating is more effective than understanding, that attacking is safer than trusting, that controlling is easier than cooperating. But every time we choose force as the first response, we reaffirm the pattern. And here is the final emotional impact. Perhaps Gadreel's legacy doesn't lie in ancient battles. Perhaps it lies in the silent justification we offer today. The story of the Watchers leads us to this point to reveal something disconcerting. The real battlefield was never just celestial, it's human nature. And as long as we continue to choose war as the primary solution, the question will cease to be why did it start? And it will become, when will we finally decide to break the cycle? If we had to condense this entire story into a single idea, it wouldn't be the weapons, fallen angels, or even a trial. It would be a mindset. The most dangerous lesson learned was not how to fight. That's when fighting seemed like the quickest solution. Violence as a shortcut. This is the true legacy. When a problem arises, force resolves it faster than dialogue. Imposition seems more efficient than negotiation. When there is a threat, attacking seems safer than understanding. And that's exactly what makes this lesson so appealing. It works in the short term. Force ends discussions. Power imposes silence. Domination creates immediate obedience. But quick fixes are rarely lasting solutions. Violence addresses the symptom, not the root cause. It eliminates the opponent, but not the fear. It imposes external order, not internal transformation. And when power becomes an automatic response, critical thinking diminishes. We ask no more, is there another way? We ask, how can we win? This change in question alters the destiny of entire societies. What began as permission to push boundaries evolves into an automatic reflex. Force ceases to be a last resort. It becomes the first reaction, and reflexes are dangerous because they dispense with reflection. The most dangerous lesson is not that humanity can fight. That's because she learns to prefer fighting. When power becomes an automatic response, patience seems like weakness. Listening seems risky. Empathy appears vulnerable. And vulnerability is something that structures based on domination avoid at all costs. But there's a hidden cost to this logic. Every time we choose the quickest path of imposition, we weaken our ability to build deeper solutions. Every time we silence through force, we postpone real conflict, and it returns later, often more intensely. Violence as a quick fix creates cycles. It ends one crisis and plants the seeds for the next. It wins one battle and prepares for another. It gains territory, but loses trust. And trust is much harder to rebuild than walls. If that was the lesson learned, it remains relevant whenever power is used without question. Whenever decisions are made solely based on superiority and not on responsibility, the problem was never the existence of force. It was how easily we came to depend on it. This dependence shapes leaders. It shapes nations, it shapes cultures. And, on a personal scale, it shapes individuals. When force becomes the norm, the world is seen as a constant threat. And a world seen as a constant threat generates constant defensive responses even when they are not necessary. This is the most subtle and most dangerous legacy. It is not an explicit teaching, it's a collective habit. and collective habits are harder to break than decrees or systems. Throughout this entire journey from the garden to the flood, from the Watchers to modern warfare, an invisible thread connects everything. The temptation to resolve complexity with immediate power. But if that is the most dangerous lesson, so the conclusion needs to address the final question. Is there another choice? Because if violence can become a reflection, perhaps responsibility can too. And perhaps the real break from the cycle doesn't begin with greater force, but with a different decision. If we had to condense this entire story into a single idea, it wouldn't be the weapons. They wouldn't be fallen angels. It wouldn't even be the trial. It would be a mindset. The most dangerous lesson learned was not how to fight. That's when fighting seemed like the quickest solution. Violence as a shortcut. This is the true legacy. When a problem arises, force resolves it faster than dialogue. When there is opposition, imposition seems more efficient than negotiation. When there is a threat, attacking seems safer than understanding. And that's exactly what makes this lesson so appealing. It works in the short term. Force ends discussions. Power imposes silence. Domination creates immediate obedience. But quick fixes are rarely lasting solutions. Violence addresses the symptom, not the root cause. She eliminates the opponent, but she doesn't eliminate the fear. It imposes external order, but does not generate internal transformation. And when power becomes an automatic response, critical thinking diminishes. We ask no more. Is there another way? We asked, how can we win? This change in question alters the destiny of entire societies. What began as permission to push boundaries evolves into an automatic reflex. Force ceases to be a last resort and becomes the first reaction. And reflexes are dangerous because they dispense with reflection. The most dangerous lesson is not that humanity can fight back. That's because she learns to prefer fighting. When power becomes an automatic response, patience seems like weakness. Listening seems risky. Empathy appears vulnerable. And vulnerability is something that structures based on domination avoid at all costs. But there is a hidden cost to this logic. Every time we choose the quickest path of imposition, we weaken our ability to build deeper solutions. Every time we silence through force, we postpone real conflict and it returns later, often more intense. Violence as a quick fix creates cycles. She ends one crisis and plants the seeds for the next. She wins one battle and prepares for another. She gains territory, but loses trust. And trust is much harder to rebuild than walls. If that was the lesson learned, it remains relevant whenever power is used without question, whenever decisions are made solely based on superiority and not on responsibility. The problem was never the existence of force. It was how easily we came to depend on it. This dependence shapes leaders, it shapes nations, it shapes cultures, and, on a personal scale, it shapes individuals. When force becomes the norm, the world is seen as a constant threat. And a world seen as a constant threat generates constant defensive responses even when they are not necessary. This is the most subtle and most dangerous legacy. It is not an explicit teaching, it's a collective habit. And collective habits are harder to break than decrees or systems. Throughout this entire journey from the garden to the flood, from the Watchers to modern warfare, an invisible thread connects everything. The temptation to resolve complexity with immediate power. But if that is the most dangerous lesson, so the conclusion needs to address the final question. Is there another choice? Because if violence can become a reflection, perhaps responsibility can too. And perhaps the real break from the cycle doesn't begin with greater force, but with a different decision. Throughout this journey, we've talked about angels, falls, forbidden teachings, and celestial judgments. But the real point was never just the past. That was the norm. We now come to the final warning. When power replaces responsibility, the downfall no longer needs heaven to begin. It happens on earth. Weapons don't start wars. Decisions are being made. A sword doesn't choose to attack. An army does not move on its own. A technology does not define its own purpose. These are decisions, and this is the thread that connects everything. from the garden to organized violence, from the flood to modern wars, from Gadreel's legacy to current human choice. Power, in itself, is not corruption. But when power ceases to be an instrument and becomes an identity, something breaks down. Responsibility demands limits. It demands accountability. It requires awareness of the consequences. Power without responsibility demands only results, and the result can be obtained in any way. That is the warning. By echoing the story we saw earlier when we talked about Gadreel and the knowledge that illuminates and can also blind, we realize that the narrative universe is not just about angels who taught too much. This is a case of humanity that learned too quickly and reflected too little. Gadreel brought knowledge from the stars. Azazel brought skill. Gadreel brought permission. But none of these teachings forced humanity to choose war. They expanded capacity. The decision has always been a human one. And here is the strongest point of the ending. The story is not about celestial beings competing with God. It's about humanity grappling with its own responsibility. When power replaces responsibility, justifications quickly emerge. It's necessary, it's strategic, it's inevitable, it's for the greater good. But the greater good rarely flourishes where accountability has been silenced. Because responsibility asks, what will the cost be? Who will suffer? Is there an alternative? Are we acting out of protection or out of control? When these questions cease to be asked, power becomes autonomous, and autonomous power always creates imbalance. The final warning is not apocalyptic, it's practical. Each generation inherits more technology, greater reach, greater destructive capacity, and also greater constructive capacity. We have never had so much power concentrated in human hands, and perhaps it has never been more urgent to remember. Weapons don't start wars. Decisions do. This means that the cycle can also be interrupted by decision. If violence has been taught as a quick fix, responsibility can be taught as a permanent priority. If power can be used to dominate, it can also be used for protection. The ending then doesn't point towards the sky. Point inwards, because true judgment doesn't only happen in ancient texts. It happens every time someone chooses. Between dominating and serving, between imposing and engaging in dialogue, between reacting impulsively or acting consciously. The narrative universe connects here. Angels may have taught them, but we are the ones who execute it. And as long as power continues to replace responsibility, history will repeat itself. But the moment responsibility returns to lead the way, perhaps finally, the cycle will begin to change.